Good morning. The sun rose about an hour ago here at the pond at Timber Oaks, and I want to speak to you this morning about the most fundamental rule in German, and that is, at least for me, and this is the one I harp on the most, and that is verb endings. What I'm about to tell you is true for all but 9 verbs in the German language. All but 9 verbs in the German language. And basically, and it's common throughout all languages, and we have it in English too, but just barely, and that's what makes it hard for us to focus on doing this in German. When the subject changes, the verb form changes. The ending on the verb changes. That's a very common thing. So, in English, for example, if the verb is to go, it's I go. But if the subject is I, it's I go. But if the subject is he, it's he goes. He goes. That S tells us this is third person singular. This is common throughout, but most languages, all of these different subjects get different verb endings. And in German, it's a little more like the other languages, or maybe a lot more like the other languages. But you only have to memorize it once. It's only it's a small set of endings, and it works for all but 9 verbs. And in fact, in the plural form, it works for all verbs except the verb to be, which is grossly and highly irregular no matter what language. Okay, now, what are those verb endings? If the subject is ich, I, here's what you have to do in German. All infinitives like to go, to eat, to play, to sleep, any of these verbs, that's how we express the infinitive in English, to, plus in German it's simply a one-word form that ends in N. Maybe 95% of the time it ends in EN. It ends in EN, but there's a pretty good handful of verbs that the verb doesn't end in en but just n. And what you do in German is you remove that en ending. So in German I start with my infinitive gehen, I remove my en, I'm left with gay, and to this I have to add those endings that I've learned, or that you will have learned. Now when I is the subject, the verb must end in E. There you have it. Ich gehe. When du, you, familiar, singular, because there are 2 forms for you in German. One, familiar, the people with whom generally, so rule of thumb, if you're on a first name basis, you would say du. If not, you would say sie. If du is the subject, the verb must end in st. So you go to the infinitive gehen, you remove the en, you're left with gay, and to that you add your st. Gehst. Now, sometimes you just add a t if this ends in s already. So if the verb is heißen, for example, you remove your en, you have heiß. You don't add it, that would be 3 s's in a row. You don't add an additional s, you just add the t. So in the du form, it's st unless the stem ends in an s or a z. Okay, or an st, which is double s anyway. And in the third person singular, sie, s, he, she, it. Now that's a little misleading. He, we like to think of it as he, she, it, sie, s, but the reality is and z, can mean he or it, z can mean she or it, and then s, which invariably means it. Okay, but that's third person singular, spoken about. When I say first person, I mean the speaker, I or we. Second person is the people or the person to whom the speaker is speaking, and that's going to be you in English. And everything else, noun or pronoun, this sie, es, they represent something. Der Mann, der Tisch, die Decke, das Haus. All of these represent a noun, and whether in the pronoun form or in the noun form, this is still true. It's still third person singular. The verb ends in T. Geht, sie geht, es geht. Das Kind geht, das Baby geht, der Junge geht, das Mädchen geht, die Frau geht. It doesn't matter. Der Hund geht. Okay, now we have the plural endings. Wir means we, and the plural wir form will always be the same as the infinitive. So you drop the en, and then you put it back. If you have a verb that ends just in n and not en, you do the same thing. You just drop the n, and then you put it back. Ich sammle, sammeln is the verb, and the wir form is wir sammeln. Ihr is you plural. We don't have a word for that in English. We do, but it's you. That's the problem. And that's why it's so hard for our students to remember this. Because when we say you, in fact, it's so confusing in English. It's so confusing that we have other forms that are technically incorrect, but get used way more than you. For example, you guys. And in other parts of the country, y'all, or however it's pronounced. So where I grew up in New York City, and it's not uncommon in big cities, yous. Well, that's not English. But we just seem a little uncomfortable with the fact that we don't have a word for you plural. Well, the Germans do. It's ihr. And when ihr is the subject, the verb ends in t. And then finally we have sie, they, and sie, you. Remember I told you there are two forms for you in German. Familiar, du and ihr, and then the formal. You could say to your classmates, ihr, but you wouldn't talk to three teachers and say, ihr. You have to say sie. And that sie is always capitalized, always, no matter where it appears in the sentence, is capitalized. And it means you, both singular and plural. And then the small, not the small z, but the non-capitalized z, the lowercase z, means they. And when z or z, when z they or z you is the subject, the verb ends in en. Or n if the infinitive didn't end in en, but just n. You just return it. So the plurals are en, t, en. In fact, that spells the word enten in German, which would be ducks. And what I like to tell students beginning, when they're first starting out, to help them try and remember what these endings are, because for some reason some students struggle with it, I tell them this.
Icky, icky, dust, dust. If z is she and in t it must. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Now what does that mean? Icky, das, dust. If the subject is ich, the verb ends in e. Icky. If the subject is du, du, the verb ends in st. Dust. Icky, dust, dust. If z is she, and in t it must. That's how you know your z means she. Because z could end in en, it could be they. But if I say sie geht, that means she's going. Or if I say sie gehen, that means they're going. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. It kind of reverses it in German. If what applies to sie applies to er. What applies to the feminine form applies to the masculine form. So when er is the subject, the verb ends in t. Now the last point I want to make is translation of this stuff. In English, the present tense is I go, I am going, I do go. This do, nonsense in English, is the only language in the world that has this form of do in the present tense. Okay, well we have it. In German, it's, I don't need any of that stuff, they say. One word, ich gehe, and that can mean I go, I am going, I do go. What? Isn't that confusing? Never. Never. If I said to you, go you, instead of do you go, why would that be confusing? And let's say you're on the telephone and you say, well, forget the telephone, you're talking to somebody and you say, well, what do you do on the weekend? He says, ich spiele Tennis, I play tennis. But if you say to somebody, spielst du Tennis? How else could you can only have two meanings. Either are you playing tennis or do you play tennis? If you're sitting down in a restaurant and you say to somebody, spielst du Tennis? Does that mean are you playing tennis? Of course not. It means do you play tennis? And if you're sitting and if you're calling somebody on the phone and you say, what are you doing? What are you doing? Was machst du? Ich spiele Tennis. I get works today because of cell phones. It means I am playing tennis. What are you doing? I am playing tennis. That's all that could mean if you say ich spiele Tennis. It doesn't mean I do play tennis. It doesn't mean I play tennis. It never, ever, 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 ever causes confusion. There is no helping verb in the present tense in German. Never! You can never say ich bin spielen Tennis. Never! No helping verb in the present tense in German. Ich spiele Tennis means either I play tennis, I do play tennis, or I am playing tennis. And the do form is 99% of the time only in questions. Spielst du Tennis? Are you playing tennis? Gehst du am Wochenende? Or do you play tennis? I should say, it could be are you playing tennis, depends on the context, but do you play tennis? Yeah. Do you ever go to the movies? Gehst du manchmal ins Kino? Do you sometimes go to the movies? What else could it mean? It can't mean, are you sometimes going to the movies? It's not a problem. So remember, never a helping verb in the present tense in German. Well, I have to take leave of you now. A beautiful morning here in Timber Oaks and all over central Illinois. Till we meet again.